Greetings of peace to everybody, and I'm sure you've already heard that my name is Sibonokuhle Ncube, and I come with joy to this forum because we're practically talking about what courses through my blood and my mind every day, almost tempting me to leave what I'm doing at seminary and, keep doing climate activism every day. And I suppose I'm caught between that space of business unusual and business as usual as I negotiate with the world as it turns right now. I come from the nation of Zimbabwe, and somehow coming up to this forum has been providence, because some of the work I was doing in Zimbabwe, and quite recently as a Mennonite Central Committee partner, caught the attention of the Anabaptist community, and I got an invitation to work with Doug and the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions on a project that is called the Global South Voices. And I think this will connect with what Chrissy recently said about working with communities that are affected. I have been working in climate change response and climate finance governance and a multiple integration of other themes as a way of trying to help mitigate and or help communities adapt to the shifting climate. And what we have come to realize about ourselves in Zimbabwe and in some of the African countries where I've been working is that certainly we are living in a high impact zone, and it becomes a privilege to be a voice amongst us here, so that I sort of share the felt temperature of the experience of the shifting climate. I know how when the weather reporters tell us it will be 35 degrees Celsius, and the real feel might as well be 30 degrees. Well, the real feel of the shifting climate in high impact regions, I think, is a serious justice issue that should add more urgency. What with the children, we're seeing the youths leading the cry for a change in policy, a change in behavior. We're seeing the children beginning to cry out louder for more urgent action. And so I also bring this cry as a woman, as a mother, as a farmer, as a development practitioner, and as a sister amongst us, to tell us that despite that there's this spectrum of denial that Doug has shared about, and we have seen the scientific evidence from Christy, the climate is really shifting, and it's real. Of the four possible responses of fright, flight, freezing, and there must be a fourth one that I might have forgotten there. We need to somehow reach out for the low-hanging fruit and figure out a way of having everybody do what they can as part of not only low-hanging fruit, but do what they can with imperfection, and hopefully the small streams of small imperfect actions will create a groundswell that will change in favor of the people that are highly and disproportionately impacted by the shifting climate. Now, what are some of the things we are seeing in Zimbabwe? If you were to do a Google search, Zimbabwe is a Southern African country, and we are landlocked. And about 50 years ago, 30 years ago, we were known as the bread basket of Southern Africa, bread basket of Africa. And in fact, some would even want to claim we were a bread basket of the world because of the food diversity that would grow on our soils in Zimbabwe. Now, my work has mainly focused in the western region of the nation of Zimbabwe, though at times I've roved across the country. What has happened in the western region of Zimbabwe is that we are seeing more variability per season. Our seasons have shifted forward by about 8 weeks, which is like 2 months. And what we know on our side of the hemisphere is you are to plant cereals, which are our staple, 25th of November. Each day after the 25th of November, your potential harvest, Mr. or Miss Farmer, is reduced by 120 kilograms per metric ton per hectare. So it means that if you were to do your calculation, once you're 10 days later than the 25th of November, you have no chance at a harvest. Now, 70% of our population depends on subsistence agriculture. And 70% of that farming percentage comprises female farmers. Now, you would know the gendered aspects of food production in the global South, and you would understand the burden of care that falls upon women when nothing is harvested. And so, historically, we know we've had our problems in the global South in general, Zimbabwe being one of the particularities. And what are some of these problems? We've had running governance problems. We've had running administrative problems. We've had running human rights problems. We've had grant corruption being a serious issue that our nations need to contend with. However, in recent years, the shifting climate has been disenfranchising swaths of the population that depend on the land for a living. You see, the loss of agency by a woman means the loss of agency by an entire family. With food insecurity, it is obvious that there's also water insecurity. And so the rains have been coming in late, and sometimes we've had what would be a month's supply or a seasonal supply of rain falling all within a week. And that in itself has brought in other problems like flooding, and we've begun to contend more and more with issues like cholera and typhoid. And there's other gender complex issues that come with such a situation, such as the higher vulnerability of women, as women spend more time foraging, looking for food, or waiting for their turn to scoop up some water. We've had women and girls to get hold of water for domestic use. And this is where we begin to see how sharp the justice issues around the shifting climate are, in the sense that these communities and the examples that I've already given are low contributors in terms of the carbon footprint. And I think we've seen very good fugues of charts and graphs to show that. And some of the questions that we have been throwing out as we've been moralizing with the Center for Sustainable Climate Solution include the following: to say, who is under your carbon footprint? And perhaps this is a question directed mostly to the audience in the global north. And somehow along the line, we tend to turn around and also shift the question to be, who is under our carbon footprint, in the sense that generationally, we are all beneficiaries of the petrocarbon of development in the world. And because we're generational beneficiaries and we share one ecosphere, one biosphere, it's one earth, somehow we need to change our discussion table and our language and parlance from being discussed around square or rectangular tables to a round table where we try and discuss as equal brothers facing a common existential problem. And some of the motivation for this has been as follows. If we were to look very closely at the emission tables, you'd realize that the United States and China have sort of like been interchanging places with other nations that are, if not in the P5 of the United Nations, at least we know that they're first world nations, and I've tended to call those global emissions Olympics, because if you go on and look at the Olympics records in terms of the gold medals, the silver medals, and the bronze medals, it's the same nations with the same distribution winning the medals in that pattern. And so we need a generational consensus where we come in and say, let's take responsibility for this as a generation. Let's take responsibility for this as a collective without developing a dialectic language or a binary language of an us and them. Why am I saying this? When we look at the tags, if I were to ask everybody who's on this webinar, if you haven't made your own clothes like I have, you possibly have a tag somewhere that says your garment is made in China. And so you see how there's a link between the consumption in the United States and the production in China. And what this means is we should be pushing for a more sacred form of production and consumption, and trying to think back of how our communities used to subsist within that framework that's called simple living, so that as a collective that's alive today, we begin to unlearn to relearn. That had a low carbon footprint. Now, the shifting climate, amongst the challenges that we're facing in the global south, I feel has become the highest producer of vulnerability. Because if you have 70% of a population unable to eat, 70% of a population unable to access clean, potable water, there's some extent to which you can argue that it's a government problem. Because eating has been God's way for provisioning for creation. Drinking has been a natural, water has been a natural commodity, a natural good that God's been giving the earth. And once creation can't access the general commons that come as an endowment from above, then we have a big problem. So I want to take us perhaps to saying a little bit more about what I have been doing, what the churches have been doing in trying to co-create pathways for sustainable livelihoods within this framework that I've just demonstrated. Noting other militating factors that include the following: there are very few remittances that are coming in to support many a household, because in Zimbabwe, for instance, we are subsisting at a level where there's more than 90% unemployment. So which means that our economy, the economy in Zimbabwe is highly informalized, meaning that the tax base is also very narrow. And you can see how the government itself then becomes very limited in what it can do, though we would want to advocate, say, for better governance, because we have many natural resources that, if better appropriated, could take care of creating safety nets. Now we know about what the natural resource curse is in many a nation in Africa. So we don't want to go there, but we want to sort of like stick to the area where individuals can exercise agency. Now, part of what we have been doing is as follows. We have been working with communities to change cropping methods from extensive approaches to intensive approaches. We've been helping households. I think annually for the past 14 years, I've been working with at least 250 households and at most 1,500 farming households to strengthen kitchen and community nutrition gardening. And within these approaches, we've tried to increase gender sensitivity so that communities have a chance at seeing men and women, boys and girls, act as equal partners in community development. We've worked at strengthening community assets that include small dams and encouraged farmers to think about moving away from planting corn. Corn came with the colonizing column. What were we eating at the time? It appears from research that we had some drought-resistant small grains. They're not as palatable as corn, but in trying to unlearn and relearn, we've begun to see that the smaller grains are, though not as palatable, more hardy and drought-resistant. We are exploring working with solar power and clean energy sources. We are working harder at growing livestock, fodder for livestock, and green manure cover crops that cover both people and livestock. I think it's good to note that this may sound ambiguous because some people think that we should stop livestocking. However, what we've discovered with some of the areas where we work is that it appears cattle, quote and unquote, are the best crop that can be grown or reared in the area. Now, another challenge that we've assisted communities contend with is figuring out how to have reliable water sources by increasing irrigation potential. We've been working on market linkage development so that local markets develop that are of necessity not entirely reliant to the larger capitalist market. And one very important thread is peace building, so that there's better community cohesion as we try and bridge the resilience gap. Another important aspect of our work has been trying to help community leaders, men and women, think about what it would look like if human rights were upheld within the community, and what the overall impact has been is that we are seeing that, for instance, conservation agriculture has changed a lot for many households, meaning that it gives a chance for households to at least get some months of adequate household food provisioning despite the late onset of rains. So that has been a big celebrated story. That's at community level, and at civil society level, we have been helping, and I have been part of facilitating dialogue with government and working with the government and the climate change desk to create a national climate response policy. And that's been working very well. And so I've tried there to highlight like the multiple levels at which our interventions have targeted. Now, if I was to be asked what we can do together to steer the ship around, I think this is our chance, and it's a joy to be working with the churches, because I sense that out of our call to steward the earth, we have a chance to live out our radical discipleship. I believe that the global north and the global south should dance, because this is one earth. I'm sure you heard me talk about working on solar power installations because we have abundant sunlight, but the cost of technology is still very high. And I know that here in America, I've seen a lot of churches doing amazing work by getting off the grid, and they too have solar panels. And so what I'm beginning to introduce here is the idea of transitioning. Whatever needs to be done to transition in the global north, I think has an equivalent transition in the global south. But what we need to think about is just transitioning, to say, what is the cost of the transition? Because I dare say, development in the global south has no chance of following the developmental stages, the socioeconomic development stages that have brought the first world to where it is now. And some of those development stages can be typified using the Rostovian model, the stage theory. There is no chance to catch up and no chance to kind of imagine, well, we also need to drink up and use up our share of fossil fuels and push to a point where the state of our development is the same as the state of that development in the first world that was achieved via fossil fuel burning. So we need to dance. We need to strengthen regenerative communities of practice, and I am so excited at our community of practice as we begin to discuss like this tonight. We need to reconfigure disaster preparedness as part of our active witness. The Bible narrative is clear that there will be disaster upon disaster, and we have been seeing it. Last year in Zimbabwe, we had a cyclone called Cyclone Idai. Recall I said that we are landlocked, and we had a cyclone hit us coming in from the Indian Ocean, which is east of Zimbabwe, and about 300 households in a settlement called Ngundu were demolished by rocks the size of the size of a standard kitchen, which would be about, say, five yards by 5 yards. And we began to see how nature is raging. Nature is hitting back. And so we need a disaster preparedness capacity to be locked into our communities of practice, meaning we need to raise sensitivity, connectivity, management information systems that will allow us to share, transfer resources, perhaps much faster than we would normally do, because what's been happening is sometimes to get resources, you have to write a project proposal that gets reviewed following a very long cycle, and by that time, the emergency is no longer an emergency, it's a serious disaster. So we have to rethink some of the ways that our institutions are working. I think some of the points have already been mentioned, to say we need to take more action and increase our knowledge, our attitudes. And by that, I'm talking about knowledge, our research, and let's share those research findings so that we not only act from evidence, but we have common actions that have a common and snowballed buy-in. Changing of attitudes, I think, has already been addressed, and changing of practices. There already are some low-hanging fruit, and I'm hoping that people will not freeze, but just from even the 3 R's that I've found in this part of the land where we reduce, reuse, and recycle, that's a very, very good starting point that can build to very high impact action. And above all, I continue to encourage that we look out for the ways that will help us strengthen a generational and intergenerational consensus, involving everybody from pulpit to pew, involving our young people, and making sure that even older people understand the balance of what it is we are talking about, now that the shifting climate is vague as a concept to most people and political to another swath of our current population. Thank you.